What's new, pussycat? Whoa, 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 whoa.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Everyday Analysis. Thanks so much for tuning in and for all the support you guys have been giving, buying the pamphlets, following the channel and stuff. It's really, really appreciated. I've got a great and very weird and interesting episode here for you today. Very quickly before we do that and bring on our guests, I'm just going to mention one other pamphlet, which I hope people will be interested in. I mentioned it a few times, which is this 4 essays on the revolutionary subject by Benjamin Studebaker. This is the one that's like selling the best on our website at the moment. So thanks to everyone that's already getting it. But if you don't know Ben, he's got a podcast called The Lack, and he's got 2 new books. One with Edinburgh University Press. He's really a political theorist, and he's done this fantastic pamphlet for us, which is basically 4 essays about what it means to be a revolutionary subject today. It covers war, Russia, Ukraine, the concept of democracy. He's extremely interesting, and I really recommend it. So I'll put the link for that below as well. And then moving on very quickly to today. Really happy to have these guests, the guests that are authors of this pamphlet, which I'm just going to show and talk a bit about for a few seconds and then bring them on. Very unusual. It kind of follows with my interest with everyday analysis of being kind of primarily psychoanalytic as well as Marxist. But this pamphlet really sort of follows what we've been doing on this channel with all the Lacanian interviews. Last week on the channel, I had Alenka Zupancic talking about conspiracy theory. And this pamphlet, Where We Go One, We Go Not All, is a Lacanian analysis of QAnon, but also with this question of addiction, this kind of which comes from Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, QAnonymous, and it's a Lacanian reading of what addiction and conspiracy means and social media, and it's extremely interesting pamphlet which is available now. You can pre-order it also at a link below. So without any more discussion, I'm going to bring the 2 authors of this pamphlet on. Thanks so much for joining us, Sean Witters and Frank Smecker. How are you guys?
Thanks, Frank. Thanks, Alfie. Glad to be here with all of you.
Yeah, thanks, Alfie.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining. It's great to have. This is our first sort of co-authored pamphlet, and it's something I definitely think is fun to do. And it's such an important topic. I mean, I love the topic. I'm really interested in conspiracy and even in QAnon myself. I did actually do some interviews with a few. One of my good friends has this podcast called QAnon Anonymous. It's one of the biggest American podcasts. And one of my good friends is one of the main guys on that, Julian Field. And I did an interview with him about QAnon. And I actually tried to give this Lacanian reading of it to him, and he was sort of having none of it. So when you guys sent me this idea of doing a Lacanian essay on QAnon, I thought, oh, this is absolutely made for me. So it's extremely fun to do. But why don't we start with just like what happened? Because you actually... It's not just a Lacanian reading of QAnon. It's also this really weird constellation, which you guys say, in a kind of Freud, like Freud does. He sort of says, well, actually, maybe it's no coincidence that we use the same sort of phraseology or same word here than here. I remember he says interesting things about the word love, for example, how like we use it in romantic context and family context. And he says, oh, it's no coincidence that it sort of happens to appear in this way. And then he kind of brings his Freudian analysis out of that. And in a way, this is what you guys do. You say like, well, you wouldn't normally put QAnon together with Anon or Enanon, Narcotics Anonymous or Alcoholics Anonymous. You think of them as separately, but perhaps it's not mere coincidence that there's something in this phrase, right? And that's the sort of launching point for your pamphlet. So why don't you guys like start by talking about how you came to do it and what sort of led to that?
Well, Frank and I, one of the things that started with is Frank and I had never co-authored a paper together before. This was our first advent at it, and it occurred to us, really, we've been having these conversations where things like this were coming up, and we decided to explore it. I'm in the middle of a much larger book project about the history of how we represent addiction to ourselves, which takes up many of the tendrils of this argument and applies it from Thomas de Quincey up to the present. And so I think the key is, and one of the things you were framing here is a kind of recognition, an intuitive one, that there was a link, not only specifically between discourses of addiction and QAnon, because that obviously lurks in its subtext to a great degree, but that there was actually this rhyming that once you recognize it, you can't unsee it. In other words, a retroactivity intervenes critically. That there's a link between not only QAnon and AA or NA, but QAnon and specifically Alanon, which is the subgroup of the Alcoholics Anonymous world that supports families of people who suffer from substance use disorders or addictions, whatever we wish to call it. And so as a result, we were suddenly like, oh, okay, we've seen this link, and isn't this what everyone is saying about QAnon, that it's disrupting the social fabric, that we've experienced this in friendships and families and things like that, people going down the QAnon rabbit hole and it like fundamentally disrupting some sort of family structure. So we thought, as you were suggesting, like this is really ripe for psychoanalytic work.
Yeah, and I guess perhaps to piggyback on that, as someone who's always had an interest in Lacan's theory, just Lacan's psychoanalytic theories do, I think, serve increasingly effective as forms of social critique, thereby allowing more sophisticated, elaborate theories of subjectivity, which, of course, is an integral element, I'd argue, to addiction. So this also allowed us to place the question of addiction in a vaster landscape where it appeared to be, I guess, well, critically, virtually everywhere in different kinds of forms, but specifically, as Sean had also said nicely, that in this sort of group formation of right-wing subjectivity and the way in which, it seems also to mimic a sort of a reliance on and support of a problem, the solution to which only exacerbated anguish and disrupting family and other social circles. So it just, Sean had made the observation, called me up. I wasn't really doing a lot of writing at the time, and this was a couple of years ago. And we were both stranded, I think, in our little bubbles, respectively, from pandemic. And it just, it was just an opportunity that we couldn't say no to. For those reasons and then some.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. So let's go back to, you sort of touched upon it a bit, but let's go back to this, QAnon issue then, and how you make the connection, because you start with talking about how on January the 6th, the Capitol riots sort of burst onto the public imagination or whatever, and you talk about this as, well, it's two interesting things you sort of talk about here. You talk about the role of jouissance here. So I wondered if you could say something about that and how that relates again to addiction, and also this idea of a displacement of trauma, because I think this also holds a key. Like people read this QAnon moment as a displacement, and I think we can maybe think conspiracy in those terms as well. But so these are the two things I'm sort of asking about. One is this idea of displacement of trauma. How does that play out in the QAnon world and in the Alanon world? And the other is, what's the role of jouissance? Why did you sort of use that as a tool to understand the relationship between these things?
Yeah, good question. I think with respect to jouissance, our critique does recognize that it recognizes reactionary politics as perhaps addicted to addiction, if we could put it that way. Or rather constituted by structures of perversion, transference, negation that I do think are at stake in particular modes of jouissance, which we point out in this essay. Perhaps, Sean, if you want to say a little bit more to that end, or even to the other half of the question.
There's that wonderful moment where Lacan says about jouissance that it begins as a trickle and ends in an explosion. And that something about that was going on in this space, particularly that led us to connect into actually a problem within psychoanalytic thought, which has been on the minds of some scholars recently. We cite Rick Luce particularly, and I think he's sort of spearheaded an investigation into the relationship between psychoanalysis and addiction. But in a lot of ways, it's an under-addressed subject within the history of psychoanalysis. I would wager, and I'll make this argument elsewhere in a chapter, rather, that it is the repressed of psychoanalysis, and has something to do with going back to Freud and the cocaine papers. I don't think that's a terribly surprising argument, but it's a useful one. But we drew on this fascinating little phrase that in one of the few moments that Carlo Vigano documents for when Lacan actually spoke of addiction. was this weird comment he makes in 1976 in the meeting on the cartels, where he says, "There's no other definition of the drug than this which permits one to break the marriage with the little pee-pee." And this comes out of a discussion about little Hans and castration. So immediately we're thrown into thinking about how addiction, or perhaps the administration of jouissance, if we want to put it that way, emerges out of some condition of castration, which I think then sets up what Frank was saying before exactly, that here we're talking about a structure that might throw one back into a state of addiction while also trying to resist addiction, which we could understand etymologically going back to its function in Roman law, which is to be sentenced, bound, or written over, again, by diction itself, by speech, to another. So there's a kind of sentencing at work in the metaphorical use of this term in the first place. So we began to look at this as a kind of means for understanding reactionary politics writ large, reacting to the fact of our castration.
And actually, that's great, because to kind of push more specifically on your question of displacement and condensation, Alfie, Sean did invoke metaphor with what he just had said. And what we also had noticed, we are kind of working with that acknowledgement or recognition that Halle and Jacobson's use of metaphor and metonymy map onto condensation and displacement in the Freudian psychoanalytic theory. So in that sense, we also looked at the ways in which that statement uttered by Lacan about breaking the relationship to the little PP kind of put in sharper relief the metonymic and metaphorical valences of the way, I guess, the structure of addiction, perhaps, the objects organized, the jouissance and the modes thereof. So maybe that answers your question more too about just how we kind of alighted upon condensation, displacement, using the structures of metonymy and metaphor, the way metaphor sort of arrests metonymic slippage to present more clarity or stasis of meaning. So we see a sort of crisis, perhaps, in those mechanisms at play too. There's so much to say about this. And in that regard too, I guess also to piggyback on something Sean had said about the etymological valence of addiction, in that universe, there's also the word adept, historically, which is interesting. And that also invokes a huge section of our paper that has to do with administration per se, as sort of an ancillary, if not integral, component to addiction, and the way in which it seems to operate really as a symptom of capitalist discourse. Anyway, I might have already kind of digressed a little too far ahead of where we're at, but administration seems to be rooted to this idea of addiction in its sort of valence or connotation of being adept at utilizing or using, administering. So we just had a go at the metonymic and metaphorical valences of what was sort of unfolding analytically in front of us.
And talking about administration, where this really gets fun, of course. I mean, if it's all well and good that we have lots of theoretical things to say about this, but the real fun of talking about QAnon, of course, is the shaman, right? We literally, that the shaman arrives on the scene, which captured the national and international imagination about something odd going on in America. Who is this figure? What are they doing there? What is their intrusion onto the scene? And there we have, as Frank was saying, the function of metaphor. Isn't this guy, Jacob Chansley, just a perfect figure for beginning to unpack something going on within January 6th and the wider continuum of reactionary politics that operate under the heading of Q or in relationship to it?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And I think you're right. That is where it gets really interesting. And I mean, I also wanted to say, like, maybe we could a bit more slowly go through this. You mentioned a couple of people who worked on it, but, this kind of question of why should the addict care about Lacanian psychoanalysis, for example, I think is worth sort of going over a bit. Like, why would this connection exist in the first place? But I think also, and maybe it's kind of where you're approaching now, but one of the interesting kind of things you theorize in this pamphlet is that administration, I guess, and the concept of the addict, I think here's what you say: it serves as a means to disavow lack in relation to the symbolic structures through which capitalist society administers enjoyment. Now, I do think that's very interesting, that the concept of the addict and of administration, as you put it, as the administering of drugs, is about a denial or disavowal of the lacking subject or whatever. And therefore, it's sort of, that is therefore the capitalist's position, to disavow the lacking subject and to constantly try to administer it and administer to lack, rather than not, or accept it or whatever. I think that's very interesting. And I think, one could see that that's a good, I don't know if that's your reading or other people's reading of the relationship between addiction and psychoanalysis, but you could also see this, and this comes to what you were finishing by saying, Sean, you can also see this in our relationship to conspiracy, and in particular with Q, that, society is lacking, but because we can't accept that lack, because we disavow that lack, we have to concoct these conspiracies or these kind of plugins administering the lack. So in that sense, that, because part of me wants to see QAnon as this anti-capitalist thing, but I know that this is why it isn't, because it likewise disavows the lack and tries to administer it, right? So there's sort of, but I think what you're saying, and what I agree with, is that these are symptoms of the same thing, right? The desire to be conspiratorial about the administration of American government or whatever, and the desire to administer your own personal lack at the level of addiction by, I don't know, the next drink or the next medication or whatever, are both symptoms of the same sort of fundamental capitalist position, that our lack should be disavowed. Is that a good understanding of what you're getting at?
Completely. And I mean, one thing I would add to this is the way we're implicated in the picture. And even right now, what are we doing? We're generating more content on a meta level. The activity we're engaged in ourselves right now is oddly implicated in this structure. Even that we might derive some jouissance itself from our participation in a meta-analysis of conspiracy thinking still puts us in somewhere, if not in the warren, somewhere near the rabbit hole, somewhere involved in that picture or scene. And I think that's why I appreciate what you tapped into there, Alfie, is that this isn't really just about QAnon. This is about a certain way in which addiction itself captures something about the modern condition, and that's I think, or particularly an anxiety or discontentment operative in the modern condition. Does this, Frank? Do you want to add to this?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this brings me in my mind back to something that was broached earlier regarding Hans, the story of little Hans. And for me, that is just a lesson in epistemology, psychoanalytically speaking. That in many ways, we are talking also about a problem with knowledge, or the problem of the lack thereof, and how we are just, in a certain sense, just to use the word because it's apropos, addicted to knowing and to knowledge. So I think that ends up actually supplementing in many ways our ability to confront lack or castration or our own limitations. And to also echo what Sean was saying, we are implicated. I believe I can speak for the two of us that we say that or this without any sadomasochism or perversion of like we're all to be guilty of this or to blame, but more to kind of look at the way in which there is an asubjective element. There is a systematicity to the demand to disavow castration, I think. And that, I believe, does instill a pain that gets expressed through these states of addiction, these symptoms of that pain, perhaps. That being said, I think what we're looking at is a disavowal of castration, universally, more or less, and the ways in which that precipitates a certain supplement that gives the subject a sense of savoir-faire. I know what I'm doing. I know what's going on. And in a world that's getting increasingly more complicated, full of holes everywhere, as it always already is anyway, there's a concomitant proliferation of conspiracy, drug use, de facto and de jure. Here in the U.S., I mean, they're legalizing cannabis, and there's, not that that's a good or bad thing, but just again, testament empirically that there seems to be just, again, a growing drive for consumption, a sort of addicted subjectivity that, yeah, probably rooted in castration anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably right. And it occurs to me, just I don't really have a take on this, but it is interesting how much TV shows have blown up around, for example, the OxyContin stuff, like the drug industry failing its people and stuff. That seems to be like a parallel strand of this move, right? So like and that's all focused on the sort of the failed administration or incorrect administration of drugs, but it does kind of leave the structure in place.
Right, and notice that even the appeal of the conspiracy in this context, instead of, the vast international conspiracy governed by the Rothschilds, we get one governed by the Sacklers.
Yeah.
So the appeal of this, and we can't help but note again, there's a way in which this also readily appeals to anti-Semitism, just beneath the surface. Like I think we have that's lurking in the subtext of this as well. But underneath all of this, I think it was really interesting for us to try as an intellectual exercise to write these anti-steps. If we, because if at the center of the 12-step movement and its approach is, first of all, the collective pronoun, right? So to step away, because if we go back to the origins of this with Bill W.'s experience within AA, was he actually fundamentally experienced a kind of ego loss during his treatments, whether as a result of delirium tremens and treatment with belladonna when he was in a recovery facility, or later when he did take LSD under treatment, though that doesn't get talked about in AA circles so much. But that has led to groups like Psychedelics Anonymous, among others, who aren't treating psychedelic problems, but actually using psychedelic medicines as part of treatment. But that conjuring of a collective we is crucial. And again, here we even have the title of our paper, where we go one, we go, and we've added the not all to this, but this is the motto for QAnon. There is some interest in the relationship between the particular and the universal, the individual and a collectivity. Yeah. And we know that relationship can be both emancipatory and healing, and it can also be used in the service of totalitarian and fascistic structures. So we rewrote the first step, which in AA is we came to admit that we were powerless and that our lives had become unmanageable. Now, what you were talking about before, Alfie, and what you were talking about, Frank, there's something in our modern existence, just the sheer overwhelming nature of the flow of information and activities coming at the modern subject, that feels unmanageable. So, how do you respond to that? Which is another way of really saying, how does one respond to the fact of castration? And we rewrote the first step in the anti-steps here, which may be the only step, by the way. That might not be 12 steps. It might be just one. We refuse to admit that we are powerless and that our enjoyment is unmanageable. So it's that refusal that initiates everything here. And that's the refusal of castration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is what the I want to say something about the Q thing here, but just tell us what these anti-steps are, just for people that haven't read it, and obviously we have, but you sort of, there's the 12 steps of AA or whatever, and you've reformulated them as these 12 anti-steps, and they are proposals that you're making, or they are QAnon versions of the, just introduce what the anti-steps are. It's a fun part of your pamphlet, so just give us a taster of
that. They're not statements sui generis from neither I or Sean. They're sort of as if a QAnon subject were to utter these or proclaim them with conviction. So as Sean said, we just structured them inversely parallel to the 12-step, the Al-Anon 12 steps. And that's what we got out of it. We
got a sort of playful, fun, imaginary imagine QAnon were hosting these meetings and had a 12-step program of their own. What were the steps that the QAnonist would have to go through, right?
That's an interesting scenario that you raised. And it does go back to something that I think is important here as well with respect perhaps to castration, but ancillary to that, the Lacanian concept of subjective destitution and the ways in which that could go errantly awry or not. And so Sean talked about ego loss as experienced by the leader of Alcoholics Anonymous undergoing the 12 steps as it's there sui generis in that group. So that seems at least putatively to have led him to a moment of perhaps arguably subjective destitution that didn't go so awry. But you ask a good question. What would happen if QAnon were to get together in a group like that and utter these anti-steps? Arguably, you'd end up with something akin to what Lacan cautioned about, which subjective destitution could also lead toward what once was the mystic experience or the revolutionary experience, these moments of grandiosity, where one starts to actually become a sort of perversion of that destitution and renders themselves the object instrument of the big other. So I want to just stress that that's also sort of embedded in this paper, is that QAnon subjects, because of these anti-steps, they tend to lead the subject to that position of destitution whereby they render themselves the object instrument of the big other that they are sort of, I don't know, in legion to or whatever.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And you mentioned there, the big other, and you've mentioned castration. And it was, for me, it was actually the second step, anti-step 2, that I felt was kind of at the heart of it, really, because it says, anti-step 2, know that a power greater than ourselves, which is Q, will restore our enjoyment of our fantasy by endlessly exposing the other's insanity. Now, I think this is very interesting because, if I guess it is to do with castration stuff, but if I was to sort of try and Lacanian theorize the QAnon stuff, I'd probably go more for like a sort of lack of a name of the father or something. And, I mean, Mlad and Dolar's done lots around this, but basically the idea that you've always got a dead father, but the problem in society today is even the dead father is dead. So you don't even have a name of the father functioning as a, relic of the past or whatever. So that leads, and I think this is obviously, can it also explain why the Donald Trump appealed and why lots of things happen and why certain forms of both on the left and on the right, or so-called left and right, appeals to a sense of order, a sense that and this is also where your pamphlet goes, except you kind of approach it through enjoyment, right? We're losing control of the ability to manage our own enjoyment. And I think that sort of rings true also, and maybe even it's sort of a thing that Frederick Jameson would say about capitalism. I don't know. It sounds like this kind of thing, and it seems true. But what the Q does, and it sort of, it's saying none of these names of the father will do. So we create this kind of mystery one that is this kind of crypto name of the father that is and isn't there or whatever. And then as you talk about how interesting the imagery is, for example, the breadcrumbs and stuff. The Q'sers, they bake the breadcrumbs. So Q drops these clues. This is the way I think you quote McGowan around this stuff and that. But and then the user is a baker who collects all the crumbs and eventually becomes a loaf or whatever. I think this is really interesting symbolism. Like the idea of baking bread is so like pastoral and elementary or whatever, but it is also this kind of cry out for this name of the father, but it comes to us through puzzle and whatever. So I think, with your anti-step 2, it is exactly this. It's like, I don't know, it's but I can sort of, okay, so I suppose my question is, what's wrong with this? Because, when I'm explaining that, I'm thinking, we do need a name of the father, and we do need a means of managing our enjoyment. We do live in a society where these things are even less possible than ever before. So isn't Q as good a solution as any? I mean, what's the problem with this critique of society, I suppose? I know there is one, but I don't.
It goes right back, I think, to the question of castration and in the way in which the appeal to the father and the big other actually plays out, where there's just, if there's that castration anxiety galvanizing that movement behind it, then perhaps there's always going to be, one, a refutation of contradiction that's inherent to that very dynamic, which is, I agree, a right-wing way of thinking to discount or disregard contradiction from an understanding of a situation. And also, I think probably from that, I just got ahead of myself. Well, I'll stop right there. That I think that at the end of the day, the difference is that castration anxiety and that refutation of contradiction that then does put in place a sort of this idea that there's a big other that cannot be traversed by its own inconsistencies. And that's the difference. I mean, there's nothing wrong with wanting a big other. I mean, in a certain state or a certain sense, we're talking about the state itself, the ability to recognize people where need actually crops up rather than the demand for more does, right? So, and also the ability to understand that inconsistency is going to traverse oneself, the big other, society, the state, that there is no subject who can have it all, that isn't lacking, right? Where we go, one, I guess we go not all, in a certain sense, to play on that too. So that's my response. You're right, there's nothing inherently wrong with an appeal to something stabilizing metaphorically, but we also know that metaphors are just inherent bundles of inherent tensions. They don't actually make the sense that they do straight away, and that's an inconsistency. So no matter how we look at it or square it, there's inconsistency, there's contradiction. I think, sure, father, the big other, however we want to put that stability, we should also understand that there's a degree of unknowability. And again, back to this thing of epistemology, I think that's in the foreground here, or just at the crux, that this is about our relationship to knowledge and the lack thereof, and just wanting what we can't actually have or what we never really had in the first place, perhaps.
And yeah. Alfie, I'll just add to this that you intuitively picked up on maybe one of the vestigial elements of the paper as well, since this has expanded and contracted into significantly larger structures at points. And Frank particularly, in the development process, we were thinking a lot about the nom de guerre and the relationship between the name of the father and whatever that one that might not be duped would be. But that maybe that's gotten we resolved that element particularly by thinking about the structure of sexuation in the first place, and the fantasy operative to it. I think best represented by the Trump tank image, right? Of like the daddy coming to our rescue, but the daddy who is the one who is the impossible uncastrated figure that we live as castrated subjects in a relationship to, that the not all categorization that drives that particular version of the we. And we might juxtapose that against like a genuine, whether we want to call it collectivist or mutual aid or just generally humanitarian vision of the possibility of a universality. That at some point, I think you're right, we do need these kinds of things that we can participate in. And we see it even, we don't talk about this here, but it's clearly something recognized in Fight Club, right? The appeal of the world that's going on in 12-step groups. There is some kind of surrender going on in there. And many people have an ambivalence about the overtly Christian language of 12-step work and the groups and so forth. But within that culture, one of the ways that atheists deal with it, and there's even a chapter in the big book on agnosticism, is that essentially like one needs to come to terms with the idea that there is something bigger than you. And one basic way that one might do this, even within the context of 12-step work, would just be to imagine the collectivity itself as the thing that is bigger. And there's a weird way in which, if we look at January 6th, it's crying out for a connection to a larger world. And actually, people were reveling in the uplift of a moment of mutual recognition. But of course, it was a perverse one in a way, and it was a violent one and a self-destructive one, but one also predicated, and this is important to our anti-steps, on the conjuring of an insane evil other that is structuring their entire project, which is not to make amends, but to get revenge.
Yeah.
And so not thinking about, like, if in the original steps, the whole idea of making amends, or even codified by like, make amends up to the point and that it's possible, but don't do it if it would cause harm to someone. So like, there is the idea that, like, if you have really done terrible things in your addiction process and it would actually traumatize a person, maybe you shouldn't contact them to make amends, and you just have to acknowledge that there, whereby the fundamental motto, and we satirically capture this in step 9, the fundamental motto, it would seem, of the Trumpist right, or the January 6th movement or QAnon, is fuck your feelings. It's really totally indifferent to the pathos that's necessary to a genuine emancipatory or collective politics.
Yeah. Were you going to say something, Frank? Or
just that. Yeah, I think that from that position, there's a true blue foreclosure of difference, and that if there is a moment of destitution subjectively for that crowd, it ends up at that impassable foreclosure of letting in difference and change. Otherwise, I think that's probably a nice way through which destitution does restructure subjectivity, perhaps in a way that is consonant more or less with establishing a new master signifier, a new paternal signifier, metaphor, new big others. It is a sort of self-critical project, but it is collectively borne out. And in that regard, it has to, I think, open the subject up to invariable difference, to be aware of one's own limitations, because that's essentially what it is. We're limited. And so, as Sean said, I mean, that's a beautiful encounter with one's own limitation, is if one has burned a bridge in the past and then can actually understand why maybe reaching out to make an amend might only, I don't know, reignite those ashes. That's a great way to acknowledge limitation. And I don't know. But yeah, so
no, I mean, I agree. I think that, and I think that's a very, I mean, you've sort of already answered. I was going to sort of suggest that the last thing we should talk about is your conclusion, where, as you were just saying, Sean, you argue for a kind of collectivity. So it's interesting. You finish with the phrases. You got your title, where we go one, we go not all, which is about this, obviously, this QAnon phrase, where we go one, we go all. And you refer to the AA, the Alcoholics Anonymous step, that there is a greater power than ourselves that could restore us to sanity. And you sort of say, well, if we have where we go one, we go all, and if we have there's a greater power that restores us to sanity, and we bring them together, we accidentally or fortuitously get this idea that the we is the greater power, rather than a religious or otherwise, or a Q or a God, but collectivity itself and universality, and that this recognition of this kind of universal subjectivity is, I mean, you even say it's the way out of a fascist thinking, which I think is very interesting, and you also suggest it might be the way out of this problem we have with managing our enjoyment inside of capitalism. So I don't know if my summary is adequate, or if you want to just sort of finish by saying what your conclusion is in your own words, that sort of thing.
Well, I mean, you hit on that thing that, I mean, we could say what's structuring our, at least my perspective on the choice that's posed here, and if we're to think about fascist politics specifically and what it offers in terms of an enjoyment, or what it might offer to the conditions of the modern world or the anxieties of the modern subject, that discontentment that we're writing about, there's that really wonderful moment where in Walter Benjamin's Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, where he very succinctly takes up the fundamental gesture of a fascist politics, which is that, first of all, that it does recognize some inequity in the distribution of resources in a society. That's like the first step of a fascist politics, that there's something wrong at work, that our lives have become unmanageable. And that's like, if we could actually, one of the things that gives me some sense of pathos about this critique is that I actually look at QAnon and I say, what's going on here that would allow people to effectively go down this rabbit hole? Why would this be so appealing? And there's that exactly, there's the elements of it where the critique is not entirely wrong. It's the next step that they take that is the real question. Because as Benjamin says, what fascism offers, instead of is actually addressing the fundamental problem, it offers, the spectacle, it offers, blood and soil and so forth, this sort of violent reactionary collectivity leveraged against some evil other in order to maintain some way of making lives manageable. And we might note there then that also in comes administration. Like what's the wish for then? That someone that would actually administer and dole out that violence enacted on behalf of this fascist collectivity. And Frank, I know you have a lot of thoughts on exactly this problem, and even I think we should acknowledge, and I'm sure Frank will have a lot to say about this, but that we have some ambivalences and doubts of our own about, like, there's something always a little slippery about invoking the collective. So we're actually quite careful on this point, I think.
Yeah. I guess I'll preface with something cheap and sort of bathos, which is that I don't have a lot of faith in my ability to think politically, to be honest. So thinking through this is always hypothetical. And I think Sean did sort of touch on some of the basics that we end the paper with. And with respect to collective and how that plays out, how that looks, I don't know. There are some great ideas. I was talking with a mutual friend some while back, actually at the LAC conference, the last LAC conference. A colleague, this fellow Miles, that Sean knows as well, and he had this nice formulation that sort of distinguished the difference between collectivity and compounding, or collectivization and compounding, and that I don't know. And Miles, if you are hearing this or you watch this, and I'm mashing this up, paraphrasing it incorrectly, I'm sorry, but the way I kind of understand it is that the collective, it organizes around self-limitation. It still accounts for the singularities and collection, but sort of what we've been saying does allow for a certain, form of the collective to maybe operate with its own inherent limitations, because that's its composition. And so there's always, again, an understanding of inconsistencies, limitations, change, difference. I think with respect to the universality of how that works, I like Ryan Engley's formulation of the particular that changes all particulars, a sort of radically contingent universality that operates through the collective, quilts the field, so to speak. But I'm also aware that this sort of functionality of universalism isn't only at play with benevolent forms. So I don't know. But compounding does seem to represent something ostensibly homologous to the collective, but a little different. It's almost as if there's this sort of a compounding of narcissism at a point of nullity, where it never goes anywhere other than a demand for sort of self-reflexive more. And back to this theme of destitution, or emptying oneself out to sort of experience anew or reconstruct one's subjectivity. I think that, again, Lacan is probably, or was right about it deviating into these perverse fields where one becomes the instrument other of the big other. In many ways, that is just perhaps maybe just the way in which one fails at that process of destitution, and then ends up just demanding more of what is fantasized of one's own homogeneity and self out there, which is essentially just, the plea for lack of castration, the plea for the phallically endowed father figure, the one who's not castrated, all these sort of mutated, perverse forms of stability that actually end up in gross authoritarian formation. And so anyway, I don't know how to answer this question. I don't know if there's an answer to it, but I do like the idea of maybe specifying the difference between collectivity and compounding, which the former involves a sort of recognition of self-limitation, of lack. And I'll just say that, perhaps a way to heuristically get to that distinguishing moment of compounding versus collectivity is, I don't know, I think at the end of the day, how one relates to lack does have a certain determinant impact on how one manages excess in their lives. So in that sense too, there's maybe a way to kind of look at whether there's collectivity or compounding. And there's a lot to be said about the logic of collection, by the way, too, with respect to sublimation and Lacan's idea of raising the object to the level of sort of the object that can't actually be collected, sets in motion the metonomic collection of objects that emulate that sort of elevated object. So that is sort of ancillary to this other logic of collectivity, apropos compounding. So again, it gets into the weeds quick. It's abstract. I don't know if there's a good answer to this, but
there, Frank, you've activated the power of metaphor in this context, which I think is really, really important. Which might be a way of summing some of this up, which is like, why were we approaching it this way in the first place? And it's a thesis that I'm putting forward, is that I really appreciated Frank's comments about Ryan Angley in this context, and thinking about the universal and the particular in this regard.
I say Ryan Engels? Sorry.
No, you said Ryan Angley. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah. There's something going on here, that in fact addiction might be one of the universal narratives. If in a world where there are few universalizing narratives anymore, addiction seems to me to be a universal narrative of modern existence, to the extent that as not only metaphor, but as material actuality, that it touches us collectively in some way that few other things do. And I know this simply because every time I talk about the research I'm doing, people start saying, "Oh, I have a story to tell you," and to notice something about the fact that if that animates people so much, so that they not only they have a story that maybe is personal about a relative or about something they experienced, that it is actually a story that offers some thread of collectivity, which leads us to the observation that we make. On the one hand, it's important, if we look at AA's response and the 10th tradition, that they attempt to be apolitical, that their vision of what is responsible is to be open to all. So I'm very careful to note that I'm not trying to bring, or we're not trying to bring 12-step groups into politics. But on the other hand, we have to recognize that addiction is always already political, that it's a political condition and category of the modern world, which we could extend further. There's something Alondra Nelson says in her study of Black Panthers and health politics, simply that health is politics by other means. And I think we can understand that addiction as a health issue is a space where this is going on, and very clearly QAnon has raised a problem for this. How do we fit this puzzle piece into the question of actual mental health interventions? How do we fit it into a broader question about our social health and collectivity as a nation or as a global community? That's really the question there, and hence we've seized on addiction as a way of beginning to at least have some critical distance or recognition about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's very interesting, and I totally agree that. Yeah, I mean, to start the conversation at least. I mean, because one thing I'm tempted to think is that, well, we often hear that we're a society that struggles to be collective, and in fact, it's and it's all individualism and not collectivity. But in another way, we actually are a society obsessed with collectivity. It's just that it doesn't actually have the political effect. It has its kind of limit in what it can do. So I think you're onto a huge sort of political and social issue that really needs thinking about. But I think obviously also a longer conversation for many other times. But it's obviously, you know, as you say, not just about QAnon and not just about addiction, but about positioning ourselves as individuals and as a collective within this particular moment of capitalism, of which these are the symptoms. So, you know, I think it's really interesting, and I'm sure, hope people have, you know, I mean, if you get this pamphlet and have a read of it, you will learn about QAnon, addiction, psychoanalysis, and other things, you know, but it is extremely interesting. And yeah, I've really enjoyed talking it through. I'd love to talk more about it. Hopefully at some point there'll be a chance for us to have a little event and discuss all this more. But thanks so much, both of you, for joining us and for writing this fascinating thing. I'm really excited to put it out and yeah, talk about it more.
Thank you, Alfie, for hosting this and giving us the opportunity to have a platform for it. It's very much appreciated, and then some.
No, it's absolutely great and lovely to see you both. So goodbye,
Thanks,
everyone,
Alfie.
and thanks for listening. Cheers.
Thank you very much.